Good afternoon, everyone. I first want to thank Derek Fildebrandt, National Director for Policy for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, to be joining with me here today. Today I'll be introducing two new private members' bills into the legislature. The first is the Costing of Public Bills Act, and the second is amendments to the Taxpayer Protection Act. I think the need for these two bills will be self-evident. We're in a minority parliament. Everyone, and I mean everyone except for the taxpayers, that is, are in the back rooms scheming about how to spend more tax dollars. And let's be blunt, Mr. McGuinty and his Liberals have broken promises before. Mr. Fildebrandt here has brought with him the pledge that Mr. McGuinty signed saying that he will not raise taxes. And it's obviously not worth the paper it's printed on. We know that McGuinty has been dishonest in this regard, and it's fair to assume that he will do it again. First, he broke his pledge when he had a mega majority and didn't have to placate anyone. He won a second majority and tossed his second pledge away also. Now he has a minority, and the NDP has publicly announced they want to raise taxes. Today, Mr. McGuinty is counting on a coalition of support from Bob Rae's former party, the NDP, to raise taxes. Rae days were bad enough. McGuinty days have turned out to be much worse. The NDP Liberal coalition, this informal, but it is a coalition, has openly said they want to raise taxes on our most productive workers. And what can we do to protect the Ontario taxpayer? We need to strengthen the Taxpayer Protection Act. From the HST to eco-fees to the Ontario health premium, Mr. McGuinty has shown his ability to ignore the law and the taxpayer in the process. What I'm proposing are amendments to the Taxpayer Protection Act. The choice for a tax-raising party will be clear. They will have to either register their intention to raise taxes with the Chief Electoral Officer, or, if that's too much to ask, they'll have to go to a referendum if they intend to amend the Taxpayer Protection Act, like McGuinty has done time and time again. My constituents are honest and have to live within their means. They don't lie or steal to make money, neither should the government. We all know, of course, that there are two paths to living within our means. We also need to realize how much money we are spending. And right now, there is no way to do that. That is why I'm tabling this innovative bill. It's the only bill of its kind in Canada that would require the costing of all public bills, both private members' bills and government bills. And we know intuitively, whether you go to buy a pair of shoes or to go and buy a car, you shop around for the best deal. That's possible because the prices are posted. We should be able to do the same with legislation. Before we vote on a bill, we need to know the cost. Before we buy into a new policy, we need to know its price. The best way of ensuring that we do not run economically detrimental deficits is by knowing how much a program will actually cost. Right now, anyone can say their pipe dream program is free, when in reality it might bankrupt us. And I ask, would we have adopted the Green Energy Act if we truly knew what its cost was going to be? Would Orange or e-health scandals have happened had we known the price? My constituents live within their means. They have to balance their books. If the government doesn't know how much things cost, it's obviously impossible to expect them to balance their books. These two bills will restrain government's insatiable appetite for taxing and spending our workers and our businesses out of existence. Taxation and debt are economic disincentives. They discourage savings and investment. They kill jobs and reward the politically able. These two bills will put the handcuffs of both knowledge and consent upon the government. Thank you. Turn it over to Derek.
Thanks, Randy. I'm proud to be here with Randy Hillier today. Randy is a consistent, tireless advocate for taxpayers inside of the legislature. In 2003, Dalton McGuinty signed a pledge with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation that I have here today, promising to never raise taxes and to never run a deficit without the express permission of voters either in an election or in a referendum. And to emphasize the point, he promised on paper to respect the Taxpayer Protection and Balanced Budgets Act. Well, we know how history turned out, and he has effectively torn them both to shreds. But on paper, the Taxpayer Protection Act still exists, but he has amended it time and again to give himself exemptions to the laws. He has been able to skirt the voters and skirt the law in order to raise taxes with only a sliver of legality to back him up. The Taxpayer Protection Act needs teeth. The bill that Randy is putting forward here is proposed to do just that. The Taxpayer Protection Amendment Act is designed to keep the greasy hands of spendthrift politicians off of the Taxpayer Protection Act so that they cannot continue to simply write themselves amendments to it whenever it suits their needs. The Costing of Public Bills Act that Randy is also putting forward is long overdue. It is simple, it is common sense, and we have needed it for years. As Mr. Hillier pointed out, many acts would have probably come under a much greater degree of scrutiny, and many more programs would have gotten a much closer eye if we had actually known how much they were going to cost before politicians voted on them. Orange probably would have never seen the light of day. Eco-fees would not have seen the light of day. And the same thing can be said of similar initiatives on a federal level. This is a nonsensical policy that should be passed in Ontario, in other provincial parliaments, and at the federal level. These two bills are a good first step on putting Ontario on the road to recovery. Ontario right now faces a debt crisis not unlike that of several European states. Right now, Ontario faces a credit downgrade. But unlike Europe, who is going to bail out Ontario? There is no big brother who is able to come to Ontario's rescue right now. Ontario needs to stand on its own feet. Ontario simply cannot become a mega-sized Greece of Canada. These bills are a great first step on getting on the road to recovery, and the Canadian Taxpayers Federation expresses its full support for these bills. Thank you.
Any questions?
Okay, on your bill where you would cost it, are you talking about costing, because you mentioned eco fees, are you talking about costing it to the Treasury, the Ontario taxpayer directly, to the public separately, like hydro, the energy bill is to the ratepayer, like what kind of costing would they have to provide?
Yeah, it will be the costing to the Treasury. Those elements that and the government under this bill would also be obligated to provide the methodology that they've used in the costing of that bill as well.
On that act, I would add that providing the methodology behind costing, a great example of that is how the Parliamentary Budget Officer conducts itself at the federal level. Whenever they release a study, say on the F-35 fighter jet purchase, they release their methodology because no economic analysis is going to be perfect, but it is important to be able to look at the analysis behind it, the data sets that are used behind it, and the assumptions behind it so that other people could try to replicate that work as well. Organizations like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation should be able to do its own analysis with the same data sets provided.
You mentioned private members' bill. I'm thinking, for instance, of the bill to overturn the ban on breed-specific legislation. Would it be difficult for a private member to get a costing for their bill to the taxpayer?
Well, under this bill, it would make it an obligation of the Ministry of Finance to do that costing before second reading of the bill. We could not have second reading of a bill without that costing in place. And again, for all bills. Now, obviously, some bills will have very minor or no cost at all, or very negligent amount, and others would be more substantive in the cost. That's why that analysis and the methodology behind your example on the breed-specific legislation, I don't imagine that would be a much cost at all to the Treasury. But under this bill, we would know exactly what the forecasted cost would be.
Can I ask about the Taxpayer Protection Act? Because how much of the Taxpayer Protection Act is it your understanding is still in place? Because the provincial government has amended it and says that they have their own legislation now in place of it. Do you have any, do you know how much of it's actually there still in the book?
Still, the Taxpayer Protection Act still is a piece of legislation in the Consolidated Laws of Ontario. How it's been diminished and its value, completely, eroded, is Dalton McGuinty has introduced an exemption every time he's wanted to raise taxes on the people of Ontario. So my amendments to that act would prevent him from putting forth an exemption into the act unless he followed the same process of what is required in the original Taxpayers Protection Act of raising taxes. That is, before an exemption could be put in place, he would have to go to either a referendum of the people and get demonstrated support, or he would have to provide a statement to the chief electoral officer during a writ period that they intend to create another exemption under the Taxpayer Protection Act.
I would add to that, this is particularly pertinent right now as the leader of the NDP is bartering her price for the passage of the McGuinty government's budget. And as her price, she is calling for a massive new tax on some of the most productive workers in Ontario. Putting the economic illiteracy of the argument aside, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is keen to see that, although we're not holding our breath, but we're keen to see that the Taxpayer Protection Act does not have yet another exemption put into it here. We want the McGuinty government to reject her demands for higher taxes on Ontarians, but if he was to accept her demands and her amendments to the budget in this respect, we're calling on the McGuinty government to still continue to stop disrespecting the Taxpayer Protection Act and hold a referendum on this very clear tax increase. I think one reason he's been able to try and wiggle his way out of this as well is because McGuinty coaches his tax increases in more innocuous language. He calls them premiums, he calls them fees. He rarely actually uses the word tax, even though this is what these are. In this particular case, Andrea Horwath herself has called it a tax. I think there's no bones about it. You can't call it anything else. Maybe you can call it a bridge toll for money, for earning income, but there's no other language you can use for it. It is a tax increase that she's proposing in her own language. So it'll be interesting to see, when there's no other word in the English dictionary to describe what she is proposing, will McGuinty try to change the language behind it, call it a premium or a user fee for working perhaps, and will he respect the Taxpayer Protection Act or write yet another exemption into it? But in any case, it shouldn't be a question. It shouldn't be a question if he will respect the Taxpayer Protection Act, and that's what the Balanced Budget Amendment, the Taxpayer Protection Amendment Act is aimed to do, so that we don't have to hold our breath and know if we're going to have our rights as Ontarians and our rights as taxpayers to have a referendum or not on a tax increase.
For any bill to make it to third reading, excuse me, the government actually has to accept that and put it on to the order paper. It's not something the opposition can do. So are either of these pieces of legislation something you actually think you could get the government to take to that level where it could possibly become law, or is this something where you're just trying to make a point and bring this issue to the floor?
No, we also understand that we're in a minority parliament these days, and your assertion is absolutely correct. In a majority parliament, there would be little likelihood that it would make it to third reading. In a minority parliament, things are different.
To get it to third reading, but the government still has last say as to whether or not it gets to...
There's other mechanisms. You may have heard some bells ringing lately, and some delay in government business. There's far more delays, and if you like, filibustering that can happen that can motivate and leverage the government in doing the right things.
Do your bills have the support of your caucus?
Absolutely. This afternoon.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.